So we have looked a little bit at what pollination is, where the pollen grain lands on the stigma, and it may end up there because of wind or because of an insect or a bird. But when it lands on the stigma, then it will germinate and produce a pollen tube, which is going to be how the sperm is going to swim down to the egg. But this part here we have not talked about yet. So when the pollen tube germinates and the sperm swim out, there are two sperm that come down to the egg. And so we look at this as a double fertilization event because there's two sperm. So we need to take a look at what is being fertilized by the sperm. And if you get a chance, take a look at this video. It's a good video on pollination. And we've already looked at this diagram too. So this is the part kind of that we're talking about here, is after the pollen grain has landed on the stigma of the female part of the flower, the pollen tube develops and the sperm swim down. So sperm are going to fuse with two different things. Fusion means to bring together, okay? So one of those sperm is going to fuse or fertilize with the egg, and that will give us the zygote. So that's normal fertilization that you would think about in humans or whatever, that an egg and a sperm get together and they make a zygote, which is going to become the next generation. But in the flowering plants, they have the second sperm, and this sperm will fuse with two polar nuclei. So these are also in the ovary. And this is what leads to what we call the endosperm, which is the food for the little embryo that's going to be inside the seed. Okay, so that whole ovule develops into the seed, and inside the seed you have the embryo, but then you also have these nutrients for that little plant embryo to use until it actually pops up above the ground so that it can do photosynthesis. So in thinking about seeds, seeds are a reproductive part of a plant, and you plant a seed and you get the next generation of the plant. And the endosperm in those seeds is helpful for that little embryo. But that endosperm is what is nourishment for us if we eat seeds. So if you eat corn, or if you eat beans, kidney beans, black beans, garbanzo beans, whatever, what you're getting nourishment from in those beans or in those seeds is the endosperm that was there for that little embryo, plant embryo. Okay, and then on the outside of that is the fruit, because remember, angiosperms make flowers and fruits, and so the fruit of an angiosperm is actually the enlarged ovary. So hopefully that doesn't make you not want to eat fruit anymore. But any time that you have something surrounding the seed, that's a fruit, and that is the enlarged ovary. So we probably normally think of tomatoes as being vegetables, but they are an enlarged ovary surrounding seeds, and so they would actually be a fruit. And other things that you might think about that you might not normally put in the category of fruit, cucumbers or squash or those kinds of things, those are also biologically considered a fruit because it's an ovary with seeds on the inside. Actually, let me go back. I guess I was going to go back and look at that picture of the tomato, but that's okay. So just one other flowering plant life cycle. I've showed you a lot of them just to try to help you visualize when and where these things are happening. But like I said, I'm not going to put one of these life cycles on a test. So when we talk about how the angiosperms are able to distribute their pollen and distribute their seeds, we've talked about the fact that wind can carry the pollen, water can carry the pollen. If it's a plant that lives in water, it's going to drop its pollen into the water and have it carried to another plant. I have a couple of videos here on plant pollination that you might take a look at here too. And then also we've talked about the fact that insects or birds or different kinds of animals can also be involved in pollination. If they're crawling around in the middle of the flower, a lot of times to get nectar, they're going to get the pollen falling on their body somewhere, and if they crawl around in another flower, they're going to drop that pollen off on the female part of the next flower that they visit. Okay, and so many times we see that the evolution of the flower and of the animal kind of go together, because a lot of these pollinators are specific to a specific flower. So if we look at this orchid down at the bottom, the yellow flower, you can see that the stamens basically come around and the anther lands right on the back of the bee, and so for sure he's going to pick up pollen and take it to the next plant. This one up at the top, just a different kind of orchid, but the flower is a little bit different, the bee is a little bit different, but they're evolved to work together for that pollination event. So when we look at fruit, the fruit, remember, is an enlarged ovary, and so basically it's protection for the seeds, okay? So this too, if you like avocados, are biologically considered to be a fruit. If you look at these tomatoes here, just to kind of point out what we've talked about a little bit, you see all these little green things here? Those are the sepals. Remember, they were on the outside of the flower, and this is the ovary that's enlarged right here, and the flower petals would have fallen off, and you're left with the enlarged ovary. So the fruit is protection for the seeds, but it's also important in dispersal, because if you have an animal that eats the fruit, many times the seeds have this pretty protective seed coat around it, so the seed doesn't get digested as it goes through the digestive system of that animal, and then it's going to end up somewhere else with a little pile of fertilizer ready to grow into the next generation. And so animals can help to disperse these seeds when they eat the fruit. So this part here, how we classify the angiosperms, the flowering plants, we are going to talk about when you go to the garden also, okay? So we can put the angiosperms, flowering plants, into two groups, the monocots and the dicots. I think your author uses the term eudicot, and I learned dicot, and I kind of like that better. And so when we look at these two groups, we can look at their flowers, and that can help us decide which group they're going to be in. We can look at their leaves, we can look at their seeds. We can also look at stems and roots. You're going to have to pull up a plant to look at the roots, so we would never ask you to do that. But it's pretty easy to see the flowers and the leaves of a plant, and so we will have you look at those. Okay, so we're going to look at monocots first in terms of what characteristics would identify them. So mono means one, and cot refers to cotyledon, which is the seed leaf. Okay, so if you have one seed leaf, you're going to be a monocot. So think about a seed, a corn seed. There's no way to split it in half. It's one piece. It's considered a monocot. And if you were to look at the flowers, now this is not a cornflower, but it would have either 3 petals or multiples of 3. Okay, if you were to look at the leaves, which maybe you can visualize a corn plant, the veins are parallel, so they run up and down next to each other, and so usually the leaves are kind of long and thin, and they have parallel venation. Okay, so when you go to the garden, we're going to have you look at some plants, look at the leaves, look at the flowers to determine whether they're a monocot or a dicot. Okay, so let's look at the dicots. So di means 2, and so we're looking at a seed leaf that has 2 parts. So if you think about a kidney bean or a black bean, you know you can split it in half into 2 pieces. That is 2 seed leaves, okay? If you were to look at the flower of a dicot, it's going to have 4 or 5 petals or multiples of that, Okay, so it's easy to count the petals. And then if you were to look at the leaf of a dicot, you can see that it's going to have a vein down the center, but it's going to have net-like or branching veins because it has veins branching out like this, and many times more branches off of those. And so that's what we call net-like venation, which you would find in dicots. And so we've talked about seed dispersal by animals, we've talked about fruits, we've talked about pollination. I just wanted to look at a couple of other examples of seed dispersal, and this is a pretty good video. I think it's a NOVA video, which is pretty good on seed dispersal. So you can have animals eat the fruit and drop the seeds out with some fertilizer, right? But you know that there are seeds that have feathery tops on them, like dandelion seeds. Those are really good at being dispersed by the wind, okay? You know there are like sticker burrs that get stuck in your socks or get stuck in your dog's hair when you go for a walk. Those are seeds. They get stuck and then they drop off somewhere else. That's a good way to disperse seeds. A coconut is a seed from the coconut tree, and it's hollow on the inside so it floats. And so if you've got coconut trees growing close to the coast, the coconuts may fall into the ocean, float down a little ways, end up at somewhere else on the coast, or maybe float over to another island, and when they wash up, they germinate and they grow a new coconut tree. Okay, so lots of ways for seed dispersal. I think these pictures are the ones from your book, so you can see these are the sticker burrs. That's actually a seed that gets stuck in animal's fur and that carries it somewhere. And then this one is illustrating a bird that eats the fruit. It uses the fruit for energy, but it doesn't digest the seeds, and they come out of the digestive system and they grow somewhere else. Okay? So the last thing about plants that I just want to mention is the carnivorous plants. And so with carnivorous plants, you guys know, I think, that carnivore means meat eater. Okay, so this sounds like these plants are eating meat. They do consume animals, but notice that all of these pictures, the Venus flytrap and the pitcher plant and the sundew, they're all green. So they all do photosynthesis, so they're considered autotrophs. But these plants happen to live in soils that are not very good soil. So there's not many minerals and things that the plants need from the soil, and that's why they consume insects, not for energy, but because they break it down to get the minerals. So if a fly walks across a Venus flytrap leaf, it's going to close up, produce enzymes, break it down, use the minerals, put the rest back into the soil. In a pitcher plant, down in the bottom here, this is just an adapted leaf. There's a lot of enzymes. It smells good to flies and so forth, so they crawl in there and then they get stuck in those enzymes and get digested. And then in the sundew, if a worm or a bug crawls across the sundew, basically the whole sundew folds over, it gets really sticky, produces enzymes, and that little fly or worm or what, an inchworm or something, will be digested by the sundew. So this is a pretty good video, just looking at some of the examples so you can see in real life those plants. So take a look at that if you have a chance. And then this last slide I want to just take a look at, and this is very general and basic, but it's a good overview of all of the plants and how we classify them. So we look first to see whether they have vascular tissue or not. So bryophytes are non-vascular and all the other plants are vascular. And then we look to see whether they have seeds or not. And so we have the seedless vascular plants, which we talked about ferns here as being a good example of seedless vascular plants. And then we have vascular plants that have seeds, okay? And those plants are either gymnosperms or angiosperms. The gymnosperms, remember, are naked seed plants, and the angiosperms are covered seed plants. And then this last little bit, we talked about breaking the angiosperms into two groups. So we looked at what the difference between a monocot and a dicot would be.